This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. Join our conversation on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. Joining us as always to talk about the news is Colin McEnroe. He's the host of Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Hi, Colin.
Good morning, Mr. Dankosky.
Also with us here is Bill Curry. He's a political analyst. He's a former Democratic nominee for governor, and he's a former advisor in the Clinton White House. It's good to see you once again, Bill.
Nice to be here, John. Thank you.
And Leah Wright-Rigueur is here. She's associate professor of public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and Harry S. Truman Professor of American History at Brandeis University and author of The Loneliness of the Black Republican. Hello once again, Leah.
Oh, hello. Always a pleasure to be here.
So much good stuff to talk about, and we're going to start in Washington. The White House has, according to the New York Times, declared war in the impeachment inquiry, essentially saying that the White House is not going to cooperate with what it calls an illegitimate effort to overturn the results of the 2016 election, and according to the New York Times, setting the stage for a constitutional clash with far-reaching consequences. I guess we'll start there, Colin. The things that we'll get to a bit later on are how Americans feel about this potential constitutional clash, but there has been a little bit of movement over the course of this last week.
Or lack of movement. I don't think it makes sense anymore to say we're perched on the edge of a constitutional crisis. This is a constitutional crisis. This is what a constitutional crisis looks like. It maybe is the beginning of the constitutional crisis. But, it's funny because the Supreme Court started its term on Monday. I was talking to Slate's Dahlia Lithwick, and I said, what are the chances that procedurally the Supreme Court gets drawn into the impeachment. Now, the court doesn't like to rule on the actual substance of impeachment. They see that as not within their purview, that should say. But then these procedural matters, are you going to produce evidence? Are you going to respond to subpoenas? These are the kinds of things that may wind up getting fast-tracked to the Supreme Court. And then the question is, we really have the ultimate screaming toddler and pottery barn in the White House right now. And what actually would cause him to stop is an open question. A Supreme Court ruling compelling the production of evidence, compelling the attendance of subpoenaed witnesses. I don't know that means anything more to him than the original subpoena did. So it really is kind of a game with no obvious end point to it. I don't quite understand it. I'm not sure what anybody understands. What are you going to drag him away in leg irons? It's not really clear to me. Obviously, failure to cooperate with due process of impeachment becomes an article of impeachment. So this will be added as an article of impeachment if, in fact, the lack of cooperation continues.
But it's an article of impeachment, Leah. It is not the same as a conviction, which would happen in the Senate, which of course won't happen in this particular Senate. And so we could add articles of impeachment all day long. We could try to compel people from the White House to testify or to produce documents, and probably none of those things are going to happen.
Yeah, so we are at a stalemate, and I completely agree with Colin. We're not facing a constitutional crisis. We are in a constitutional crisis. We've been in a constitutional crisis since the moment that Donald Trump stepped into the White House and decided that the rule of law didn't apply to him. And I think what was really quite remarkable about the letter that went out the other day is that it essentially said there is no reason no legal reason, no constitutional reason, no political reason for me to turn over these documents, and so I won't. If you want me to, make me. And essentially calling Congress's bluff. So I'm not necessarily sure. I think at this point it's clear that Donald Trump, barring some, congressional miracle, is going to will be impeached by the House. Will he be convicted? Most likely no, because the votes aren't there in the Senate. It is useful, I think, to turn and look at some historical precedent, even if the lineups are not there. Everybody has been comparing it to Richard Nixon, but we forget that Richard Nixon, was surrounded by his colleagues, from the Senate and the House, who said, Mr. President, it's over, right? It's a wrap. And he resigned before, impeachment could actually be a thing. With Bill Clinton, we know that he pushed back. He did that public apology, and then his numbers went up. But it did, in the long run, play out and have some, play out in the election, in the 2000 election. We can debate about in what way, but it did have long-term consequences aside from the fact that the Senate voted to acquit the president in that case. So we're facing down, I think, all of those things. But at the very top, the most important part is we essentially have a president right now who says the Constitution doesn't matter. What I say matters.
Yeah, it's interesting, those two historical examples you used, though, Leah. On one hand, a group of senators getting together and saying, Mr. President, it's over, it's time to go. That's probably not going to happen. And the second example of Bill Clinton issuing an apology, well, I mean, that's laughable. That's certainly not going to happen from Donald Trump. So neither of those things are even on the table.
Right, exactly. So we're in completely different territory. As a historian, I do not like to say, unprecedented, because there's always something that we can pull back on. But we are really in uncharted territory, uncharted water here, because this is the thing that constitutional scholars across various disciplines have been warning us about, that at some point there is going to be a crisis of the Constitution wherein people are going to have to, choose sides and really decide how it is we want our government to function and the three branches of government to function.
Bill?
Well, I think, one of the things you hear about impeachment is that it requires the public. It's not just the House, the Senate, and the person being impeached, but the American people. And one of the things we've learned in the last 10 days is that simply by deciding to have impeachment proceedings and also by the revelation of these tapes, of the text that came out of the first closed-door session, that 9.5-hour session that the Intelligence Committee had, just the release of those texts has moved public opinion about 16, 17 points. So now there's a strong majority favoring the impeachment in the House and about 50-50 split on conviction before a single public hearing, before even a single public hearing. So it suggests that the risk of impeachment was overestimated by the Democratic leadership of the House and that they're on pretty solid ground politically. The second thing you need, though, is the courts. And it's important to remember that in both the case of Nixon and Clinton, no Supreme Court decision, no impeachment. No Supreme Court decision in Clinton v. Jones that the president was liable to civil lawsuit, and no impeachment in Nixon without a court decision. Those are both 9-0 decisions. That in itself is unimaginable today. And so the real question here about the courts, in my opinion, these are the most clear-cut issues that you could possibly imagine. There's no question about the power of the Congress to do this. There is no precedent that suggests otherwise anywhere. And the question is whether the court did the Nixon tapes case in 2 weeks. And the question is whether this judiciary, which I believe has been so corrupted by ideology and partisanship, can function as the judiciary, let alone whether the Senate can function, whether the judiciary can function. Lastly, I'll just say that if it turns out that they can function and in time, no impeachment has ever taken more than 4 months from the first formal act to the last. That gives you till the day before the Iowa caucuses, counting right now. If the court acts in a timely fashion and does the obvious right thing, then Trump has a decision. We've already begun to see articles written, even in the New York Times, Washington Post, Establishment Press, finally speculating about whether Trump would leave office if he loses. There are people finally having that discussion. It's easy to imagine we ought to have a discussion about what we'll do if Trump gets a Supreme Court decision he doesn't like. But I do believe that that's the one, just somebody saying, that's the one scenario in which I can imagine Republican senators voting to impeach. If the Supreme Court were to, by a lopsided margin, tell him to pony up the documents and the witnesses he's withholding, and if he continues at that point to stonewall, what happens then, in response to what Colin was saying, what happens then is it goes to a vote in the Senate, and the Senate decides whether a president can utterly flout the Constitution and the Congress.
And I don't know, Colin, is there anything that you've seen that suggests that this particular group of senators is willing to do that, regardless of anything that Donald Trump would do or say or threaten?
Well, when we have these difficult to fathom questions of public policy, I often turn to the world of poetry. And in the world of poetry, I believe I found some of Donald Trump's—
Is it a Beowulf reference?
Very close. 50 Cent. So I think I've found some of Donald Trump's thinking in 50 Cent's famous 21 Questions. Now, 21 Questions, as you all remember, is sort of a plaintive series of questions by the singer about under what circumstances his lover would cease to love him. So, if I didn't smell good, would you still hug me? And things like that. So I think Donald Trump is kind of doing that right now. I mean, here he is perched on the exact lip that we've just been describing, where, in fact, probably the only thing saving him from ruin is the intransigence of the Republican majority in the Senate. Except that what does he do? He enacts this Turkey policy that is going to set them off like rockets. Within 24 hours of having established what the contours of this battle are going to be and the necessity of having Republican support in the Senate, he kind of pulls a 50 Cent, He does something that makes him less worth dying on the cross for. It's like he wants to test their love. I mean, this is stuff that they don't – it's not just Mitt Romney. This is even McConnell jumped off the bus on this. It's sort of hard to imagine what his thinking is.
Yeah, yes, I would say, though, Leah, that one of the things we want to get to, Bill was talking about the recent polling and the polling that has changed over the course of the last couple of weeks. Americans basically split on the idea of impeachment, but there's still an enormous amount of Republican support for Donald Trump. It's not just the base of support, the so-called base that is about 30% of America, that's the Donald Trump base, but we're talking about 80 to 90% of Republicans think that everything he's doing is just fine. And so, given the fact that most Republicans are going to support just about anything Donald Trump does, given the fact that most Americans right now probably aren't too terribly focused on what's happening in Syria with the Kurds and Turkey, maybe their senator might get all exercised about it, but they're not going to get all exercised about it. Do you see anything actually changing for these Republican senators?
So on the one hand, I remember it was a while back on this show, and Colin said to me, "There is no line in the sand, right? There is no red line through which would cause kind of Senate support for Donald Trump, Republican Senate support, to go up in flames." Although one of the things I think is important here is that while their support for Donald Trump has been pretty steady, pretty unyielding, there are moments like this Turkey-Syria incident or event, whatever we want to call it, where Republicans have broken with Trump very loudly and clearly. And we've seen instances of this over the course of his tenure in office. And oftentimes that has to do with when they think this is going to affect their bottom line. So whether it be their position on foreign policy, whether it be their position on the economy. We've seen Mitch McConnell break with Donald Trump over Trump's proposed $1 trillion infrastructure bill that has yet to materialize, where McConnell said, I dare him. Watch who really controls the Senate. So I do think that there are moments where Republicans, whether it be the base, whether it be generalized Republicans, will continue to say we support the president, but also will push back given that it affects their bottom line. So it is possible to do both. We also know, however, that it is possible to do all of that and still move on, hold your nose, and vote for someone you strongly dislike. I think that's very clear with somebody like Lindsey Graham, who prior to 2017 was very outspoken about his dislike of Donald Trump and did an about-face and was quite explicit about saying, well, the only way that I have access to power in the executive office is by being friends with Donald Trump. So we're now seeing that play out with somebody like Lindsey Graham, who is very upset about the Turkey-Syria decision-making, foreign policy, and who has said that this is a terrible decision if this is in fact what the president plans to do. So that may have consequences, but I got to come back to that point by Colin. We still don't know what that red line is.
I want to actually quickly turn to something as we talk about Donald Trump's support, something that you brought to us this week, Lee. I hadn't seen this piece in Politico, but it's a story about a conservative leadership summit of young African Americans meeting with Donald Trump, talking about why they're supporting this president, why they are Republicans at this particular moment. You've written about black Republicans quite a bit. What do you see that's new about this story and this particular group?
when I originally read the story, the first thing that struck me is that this is in fact not new, that Republican presidents, dating back to Nixon, have regularly brought in these large groups of African-American Black Republicans for these summits, for these kind of leadership think tanks, for, position papers and symposium on a quite regular basis. In fact, it's odd to see a Republican president not do it, right? So that would be something that's new. What is different, however, and I will also say the groups funding these organizations, like in this case it was Turning Point, but in the past it's been other conservative organizations, that's not new either. What is new, however, is the kind of hashtag movement of all of this. And I think that's worth paying attention to. So, I think they are calling themselves Walk Away. They're also calling themselves Blexit. They have different iterations.
This is Blexit. This is a black Brexit from the Democratic Party.
Right. And while that may in fact not lead to anything in terms of, increasing black support for Donald Trump, what it actually may have a measurable effect on, particularly with the advent of technology and changes with, say, social media, is black voter depression. So it may actually depress, not suppress, depress turnout, right? So encourage African Americans not to vote because of, say, dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party. And so that's what we're hearing a lot in these conversations with these kind of young black people who are showing up at the White House.
Bill, what do you make of all this? Because we've heard this story before. A lot of black Americans, and not just those who want to gravitate toward the GOP, have said, "Hey, Democrats, please don't take our vote for granted."
Yeah, that's a trope I actually hear more often from white Republicans than from black Democrats, or as often. I mean, that's been peddled as a conscious propaganda point. There's also real truth to it. Okay, so it exists on.
I've heard it from a lot of black non-politicians.
No, there's no question. No question. It's a combination of a more sort of inchoate feeling, but it never shows up in the data at the end of the election. Okay, so far. I think that there is a natural conservatism within the African American community that especially white liberals may miss, and there is a sense of Democrats taking for granted first, African Americans, but secondly Hispanics, thirdly the young, every single one of these demographic constituencies that we think we'll have as a matter of right. I remind people that in 2016, 3 times as many millennials voted Libertarian as voted Green. That there's something more complex about that youth vote. I don't believe that this racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic Republican Party can attract significant African-American votes or many more Latino votes. But 4 years from now, 5 years from now, when there are 20 million more people have turned 18 and when some of the older folks have passed on, the Republican Party is at an extraordinary crossroads. I don't see how it negotiates that crossroads right now. But a new conservative party of some kind that can say, did the Democrats take you for granted, that can appeal to more conservative instincts. Also, as I said, the African-American community, in my own experience in politics, it's the last community that really honors its own leaders in a way. That what ministers say, what a mayor says, what a congressman says, there's still some community pride. And much more than white voters who have just totally turned on their leaders in government, there's still something there. And that has an influence and a conservative impact.
I thought this is a really interesting phenomenon, and I enjoyed reading about it. And I think we're going to hear a song written by one of the participants in this meeting with Trump here at the end. But I don't think it's statistically significant. Something like 4% of black voters think that Trump has been beneficial to black Americans. I think the larger point, I circulated a piece by Perry Bacon from 538 talking about why black Democrats tend to gravitate towards more establishment Democrats like Biden, less likely to be attracted to an Elizabeth Warren. To me, that's the one where there's going to be some numerical meaning. And, of course, turnout. I mean, Leah is absolutely right to talk about depression. One of the things we discovered in 2016 was black Democrats were more comfortable with Hillary Clinton because she's an establishment Democrat, but not as excited about her as they were about Barack Obama in terms of turnout and stuff like that. So to me, that's the thing you have to watch than reading on the dials.
When we come back from our break, we're going to turn our issues to the local, a place where race is also playing a bit of a part here. This is in Bridgeport in the mayoral election, which is back in court. We're going to go out of this segment with a guy named Joel Patrick. Yeah, this is a song from a guy who was actually featured in this Politico article about young black Republicans. Let's listen as we head to break here in the Wheelhouse.
With the King Ranch trim, cruising around the city in my 35-inch rims. I'm country, not because I'm a skin. It's not about what you are, it's from where.
This is the Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky, talking about the week's news with Leah Wright-Rigueur. She's from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and also from Brandeis University. Bill Curry's here. He's our Democratic political analyst. And also with us, as always, of course, is Colin McEnroe, the host of the Colin McEnroe Show. Hey, Colin, what's on your show today?
Seem to have music on the brain. We were just talking about Kanye during the break. Today is the second half of our unprecedented two-part interview with Jimmy Webb, which we conducted out in some recording studios on Long Island. I'll just leave it at that. I really have enjoyed working on this. Betsy Kaplan has done just incredible work putting together this. It's performance, it's talking, it's an unusual view of Jimmy.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. Part one was excellent, so listen for part two coming up today at 1 o'clock on the Colin McEnroe Show. Okay, so we're talking about national politics. Let's turn to our friend Ken Dixon in the Connecticut Post, reporting on court yesterday. An elderly North End woman, he writes, testified from a wheelchair in Superior Court on Tuesday that her first absentee ballot for the September mayoral primary was apparently lost, and a second ballot was delivered to her door by an unidentified man who watched her fill it out, then took it. An apparent violation of state election law did not change the way that Ruth Walters voted, however, she told Judge Barry Stevens. This is all part of an investigation, and it's also part of a lawsuit over the way that these absentee ballots were handled in the primary election. This, Colin, is a primary election that Joe Ganim won by a very narrow margin over Marilyn Moore, a state senator who was running against him. And then this all ends up in the New York Times as a story called charmingly, "Why This Ex-Con Mayor is Running Away from Reporters."
Yeah, I mean, Joe Ganim in that article did kind of an unusual thing, which was to make a date to meet with a New York Times reporter and then just sort of run away when the questions turn a little fierce, and then kind of re-rendezvous with the reporter and have things fall apart yet again. And then in that same article, we also see him visiting, I think, a housing development where he gets some questions from citizens that he doesn't like about police violence, and he runs away from that too. So to me, he looks a little jumpy right now. I mean, it could be argued that it's an act of supreme confidence just to walk away from a New York Times interview, but I don't see it that way. I also don't see a particularly meaningful outcome from all of this, unfortunately. I mean, I think it would be a better world if Marilyn Moore were mayor of Bridgeport. But courts don't like to overturn election results. I mean, they just really don't. SEEK, which is the state agency, we look at this as a pretty slow-moving agency. It's unlikely, and where does that end, with a fine or something like that? And then the write-in campaign, although Mike Jargera did it, was under very different circumstances. So, but it's good anyway that light is being shined upon absentee ballots, which are a mess.
Okay, so they're a big mess, Bill. I don't know what you see in all this. I don't know that it's that surprising that Joe Ganim's running away from reporters to the New York Times, but reporters to the New York Times aren't going to vote in this upcoming election. He's shown that when he runs for governor, people don't care about Joe Ganim. But when he runs for mayor in Bridgeport, even after spending 7 years in the Hooskow, he seemingly does just fine because people like him there a lot.
I think a lot gilds that lily a little bit, but there's some who do.
A lot-ish.
I would like to say that I did win a couple of wagers within this very building as to whether or not he would win any cities or towns outside of Bridgeport when he's running for governor. He did not. And I don't think Bridgeport thinks all that much better of him than we do, but I think that Bridgeport has far fewer options than we have and has a democracy which is in even more tatters than the one we're all living under. And so there you have it. A lot of institutions had to fail to do their jobs to elect and possibly now reelect Ganim. I'm shocked. He spent most of his term in those incidents that Colin recited from the article about his blowing off those meetings. He has not been an engaged official. He didn't come back and say, this time I'm going to do it really right. And he spent most of his time running for governor and doing other things, who knows what. But he hasn't really been a hands-on mayor or an effective mayor. And he should have lost this primary. He should have lost the first one. It breaks my heart. The cities of Connecticut have a modern history of exceptionally bad political leadership. John DeStefano is a great exception in New Haven. Every so often, a city catches a break and has a really good mayor. And of all the things that are wrong with our cities in transportation and tax structure and 100 other policies that stifle and strangle them, that bad leadership, if you want to see how much political leadership matters, just look at the effect of bad political leadership on the cities of this state. It breaks your heart.
And Lee, what do you make of all this? Because this bad political leadership that Bill's talking about is not just something that has happened in Bridgeport. The voters of Bridgeport, went back to Joe Ganim. They're going to probably go back to Joe Ganim one more time. I'm not necessarily sure that he's the only option. But as Colin said, Colin thinks maybe Marilyn Moore would do a better job. Marilyn Moore couldn't even get her name on the ballot in the November election because she couldn't figure out how to do it. There's a lot to parse out of there. But I think Bridgeport voters have said, yeah, we're okay with Joe Ganim coming back.
Or, a couple of things. One, this is why people hate politics. Two, one of many reasons. But this is a microcosm. This is a great example of why people hate politics. But also, two, one of the things that we say just more broadly is that a healthy democracy is one in which there's high voter turnout, where people come out, where there is a healthy engagement with the body politic and with the electoral process. I think moments like these, particularly in the Bridgeport case, but really across Connecticut, showcase that we are not in a healthy democracy right now. Low voter turnout. When we talk about this is the person that the voters elected. Part of the reason why this is the person they elected is because turnout is not where it needs to be in order to have options. And people, one of the main reasons that people move away from turnout and don't come out is because they are disaffected from politics. But also, I think the other part, and this is the difficulty getting on the ballot, the fact that it is not that politics is not accessible. And so we saw that in a lot with the Ganim stuff and in the testimonies from people on the ground, right? A number of the people were talking about they had disabilities, they were living in housing projects. It was not easy to actually participate in the voting process. So we're seeing just a whole slew, I think, completely agree with this point about, this is what dysfunction looks like.
Well, it's what dysfunction.
That last point is a great point. That's really so true.
It's what dysfunction looks like, Colin. What's so funny though is Joe Ganim, Bill said, maybe hasn't been that engaged. I've noticed an awful lot of press releases coming out of the Ganim administration in just the last couple of days, as a matter of fact.
Well, one of the funnier ones was about an event that he was helping to host called "Fall into a Suit." It's a very good idea. It's getting appropriate business clothes for ex-offenders as they enter the job place. But it was kind of funny because during his trial, a matter of testimony by his aides was that whenever he needed shirts or whenever he needed suits, they would use some of the graft that was coming in to buy him those things. So it takes a certain amount of chutzpah to be Joe Ganim and host the Fall into a Suit event for ex-offenders. I would just quickly say that, on primary night, there were a lot of big surprises. And I think a lot of us said at the time that the big surprise was Justin Elliker's trouncing of Tony Harp. In retrospect, the big surprise of that night was Marilyn Moore beating Joe Ganim on the voting machines. She won on the voting machines. Nobody thought that was going to happen. He needed those absentee ballots to squeak out the win that he's got. So that tells me that people of Bridgeport, she hasn't run a great campaign or anything, but they are restless. They are not happy with this guy.
When we come back, we're going to talk about tolls. Whatever happened to tolls here in Connecticut? That's all the rage earlier this year, and we're not talking about it anymore. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to some people who are going to talk about something different. They're going to talk about how you can support Connecticut Public Radio and all the great programming you hear, not just the Wheelhouse, but the Colin McEnroe Show and Where We Live, all things considered in Morning Edition. They're here to ask for your support. Hope you can join them. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We're talking about the week's news with Leah Wright-Rigueur. She's Associate Professor of Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Also, Harry S. Truman Professor of American History at Brandeis University. Take a deep breath here. And author of The Loneliness of the Black Republican. Also with us is our Democratic political analyst, Bill Curry, former Democratic nominee for governor and former advisor in the Clinton White House. And Colin McEnroe is here. Of course, he's the host of The Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Bill, I know you spend time up in Maine, and you were making the drive back and forth. You noted that you were paying tolls to a lot of different jurisdictions.
You can start in the far north in Washington County, Maine, and drive all the way to Washington, D.C. on the Atlantic seaboard, and only go through one state that doesn't have tolls.
What state's that, Bill?
Okay, here's the great thing about this. It's ours.
Yeah.
Okay. I knew you'd be shocked.
Well, I mean, a lot of people would say that
Yeah.
is a great thing, right? Don't have to pay
Yes.
tolls in Connecticut.
If we had taken care of our infrastructure all along and had been properly funding mass transportation and didn't have a mass transit crisis, I wouldn't care. And it's only because we have such. This goes to the fundamental necessities of government. This is government's among its 4 or 5 core duties. Everybody agrees on is to construct a transportation system that makes economic development and urban revitalization possible. And we've never done that. We're going to need the tolls to do that. I think Lamont made a great mistake running against them, except for that tiny exception of big trucks, and then proposing such a comprehensive system. It's a big switch. It reminded me of Bill Clinton promising a middle-class tax cut, and then, in good faith, with Al Gore offering a massive carbon tax. And the public, it was the first thing that really went wrong in his first term. People said, that's not what you told us. This is a regressive tax. The tolls are tough to swallow. But I would just say, lastly, to the people of Fairfield County, who are the principal opposition, by far the most ferocious opposition to tolls, comes from the southwest part of the state. They have 2 problems: exorbitant taxes and a permanent traffic snarl on 95 that undercuts both economic development and their quality of life. If they don't bite the bullet and have Connecticut join all those other states, all of them, and tap this revenue source, those 2 problems of property tax, increasing property taxes on their homes and inability to get to work are never going to leave them. This is their one chance to get this done.
Well, Ned Lamont has been saying, Leah, that there's another chance. They've been looking more closely at federal dollars that are being left on the table, new ways to get loans out to pay for new highway improvements. Republicans are saying we can borrow more because nobody really wants to talk about tolls right now. Is Bill right? Is the only way to pay for transportation infrastructure improvements in a state like Connecticut tolling us up on the highways?
So I have to say that, Bill, you've explained it and you've outlined it in a way that is far clearer than anyone.
Well, that's very sweet of you.
Anyone.
Right back at you.
And I think one of the things that would be intriguing to me is, despite everyone saying, we don't want to have this conversation around tolls, is actually having an educated conversation around tolls.
Yes.
I mean, aside from I think to Bill's point, the biggest complaints coming from the southeast part of the state and, these people who are enmeshed in all of these problems, complaints have also come from people who are like, well, what about the burden of additional, money or the cost of, moving through the cost for low income or working class communities moving through, right? A toll is not just a toll. I would be really interested in having conversations around what are the alternatives, or what are the ways in which we can put in, say, a toll, and maybe it's a minor toll, maybe it's something like that, but also take into effect the kind of account or the kind of impact that this would have on the people who would be hit hardest by this. But the first step is actually having conversations and actually talking about it.
But you were talking earlier, though, Lee, about the broken political system that allows our cities to be run badly and to have only 20% of the people show up and vote. I mean, another sort of part of that broken political system is having a toll plan that people don't believe is actually going to go to fix the very highways it's supposed to fix. I mean, for years, the reason we didn't do it the right way is because we spent all the money that was in the Special Transportation Fund on other stuff, and people have no confidence whatsoever that government will take whatever money they get and spend it the right way.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, and also to Leah's point, earlier point, the whole discussion has been conducted in a vacuum in terms of the policy. When we collect all those revenues, what exactly are we spending them on? And why do we need the things that we propose spending them on? And they haven't even really gotten to the first point.
I would, obviously they haven't broken through in any way. Otherwise, we would be looking at a special session right now. And, it's like October. This is not usually how long it takes to get to a
Halloween
special
would be
session.
the wrong time to do this.
Right. So, he has a problem, which is he needs to – I had the exact same reaction as Leah did. When Bill was talking, I was thinking, okay, if it ever got explained that coherently, at least a few more people would jump on the bus. I haven't heard anybody explain it that coherently. For Lamont, he needs a different bag of tricks right now. If anything that he had said meant anything to Arasimowicz and Looney, who have to restart this process somehow, they would have done that. So and it's a real problem because I also absolutely agree with Bill that this is one of the things that we have to do, and we also have to be clear and articulate and responsible about how that money gets used. But people don't like to feel pain that they can actually feel. If you offer people the difference between the pain of paying a toll today and the pain of a loan that comes due in 15 years, they tend to choose the latter, even though they shouldn't, even though they're currently experiencing pain from loans just like that were made 10 to 15 to 20 to 25 years in the past. It's very, very difficult to get people to do this. And I think Connecticut people are especially crabby about it. And I don't know how you deal with that.
Well, but a lot of the people I think who are crabby about it are people who aren't necessarily affected, as Leah suggested, at the lower end of the economic ladder. A lot of the people who will be most affected are folks who probably can't afford the tolls that are going to be put onto their morning commute. But a lot of the loudest voices we hear, Bill, aren't necessarily those voices. They're conservative voices. They're Republican voices. They're people who are saying that it's going to slow our overall economic growth, and we just don't need one more tax, even if I have, frankly, the money to pay for tolls now, as opposed to putting something else on my child's bill 20 years down the road.
Right. The truth is, in my own view, that it's the opposite. That the opposite is true, that if you don't fix the transportation structure, that's what will kill economic development. And by the way, southwestern Fairfield County, it's the economic development engine, not just for the people who live in Fairfield County, but for all the rest of us. That's where the great growth has been. And if we screw this piece of it up, a lot of development didn't come to Bridgeport because the city was foolishly pursuing a casino at the time. And a lot of major corporate people felt that would use up what was left of their transportation bandwidth, and therefore moving to Bridgeport would not work for them. I just said two things. One, I underscore that for Democrats, it's just like the Medicare for All thing. You can't tell people you're going to force them into a system you haven't built yet or even really described. They have to see it, and they're going to have to see this plan and have it explained why it works. Our inability to build a case based on facts and logic is hurting us once again. And the second thing is, Democrats should really be clear about Stefanowski's. They're taking the Stefanowski, we can borrow it, and there's a bunch of federal grants we didn't know about. The latter's not true, and the former's a mistake. So the way that even Democrats are discussing paying for this right now, more loans for the state and some ephemeral federal grants that somehow people didn't find before, not true.
I will say, though, Leah, that if people in Connecticut want to see what it looks like, there's a very nice Massachusetts-shaped diorama just to the north of us. They've been doing this for quite some time. They've got the overhead tolling. They don't have the toll gantries anymore. We have to stop and throw quarters in.
And nobody goes to Massachusetts anymore.
And that's exactly
right. The place is a ghost town.
I'm sitting across from someone who lives in Hartford, but yet somehow goes to Massachusetts.
You can be sure that
all the time. I don't know. It just seems like we can at least look at what Massachusetts is doing because they're funding their highway transportation through this.
I will say that the elimination of the actual physical toll booths does take away a lot of the pain, right? So you don't even you don't know until you get that bill in the mail.
Speaks from some experience.
From Easy Pass that you have paid the toll. But I will say, so the one of the larger complaints from people is the constant tolling, the pulling. But the complaints are relatively mild compared to the actual kind of questions around infrastructure. So I do think that one of the things that we should consider is that Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey. I mean, I lived in New Jersey for I think 7 years. There is a toll for everything. There's a toll for a jug handle. There is a way in which other states have made these conscious decisions as a source of kind of revenue, but also as a way of feeding into fixing the system. And the residents there have essentially accepted it. So there is, to your point, John, there are models that people can look at and can quite literally feel.
Yeah, and good models, bad models, at least models that we can look at and benchmark against. Okay, we're almost at the end of the show, so we want to go to some of our feats of strength or maybe grievances we'd like to air. And Leah, I'm going to start with you. Do you have a feat of strength for us?
Absolutely. So today is my wedding anniversary.
Whoa, and you came in here?
So I know,
Wow.
but it's early in the morning. So 9 years.
9
and
years.
I have
Congratulations.
I have to give a shout out to my husband, Philip Berger. So happy anniversary.
Oh, happy anniversary to you and to Philip.
Congratulations, Philip.
That's a great feat of strength. 9 years. Okay, Bill, how about you? What do you got?
So I've got I have two in a sentence each. First, 2.9 billion birds have gone missing just in the last half century, a third of the entire bird population in North America. It's one more cataclysmic climate change result that's already happened. Our inability to sustain a discussion about it is my grievance, and my strength is you. I don't know that I'll be on with you again in a radio show very soon. The gift you have given this state, the quality of the news department here that you and programming that you more than anyone built, I'm grateful for it every day.
Thank
and
you,
I just
Bill.
want to thank you.
And thank you. Bill, first of all, thank you for coming on the air with me so many times. And you were one of, if not the very first person
I
ever come
was
on
the
Where We
first.
Live with me. So
Yes.
thank you very much. And thank you, friend. Colin, how about you?
All right, so two quick ones. One of them is Connecticut Sun. I've been trying to make an attempt to root for the Connecticut Sun. And so they tied 2-2 in the finals last night. They squeaked out a win over the Mystic. So there's it's a 5-game series. So the finals will be Thursday night. The Connecticut Sun it's a nicely balanced team. It's not a superstar-oriented team. It's the same 5 people on the court for most of the game. They really know each other. They play together really well.
Big crowd at Mohegan last night, too.
Right,
Yep.
yeah. And then lastly, I was looking up money that was being spent on Facebook for impeachment-related advertising, and obviously Donald Trump leads the pack. But number 2 is Penzies, the spice company. So I looked this up. Penzies has run this, they now have run this kind of spice liberally campaign, and they are taking very, very interesting political positions for a business that's retail and, needs basically for everybody to want their spices.
It is very interesting. I learned about Penzies' political stances recently. I want to thank Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show, Bill Curry, our Democratic political analyst, Leah Wright Reger, who's both from the Harvard Kennedy School and also from Brandeis University. I'm John Nikoski. Here's my feat of strength. I'm going to turn this over to some people who are going to tell you why you should support public radio, because public radio is here for you each and every day. You can help support it right now, and they're going to tell you how. This is The Wheelhouse.